How do you understand the world of isms thrown at you in the history of psychology? No, not racism, sexism, and heteronormativism. Those are topics for another video. I'm talking further back, and more fundamental to the founding of psychology as a science: rationalism, empiricism, and romanticism. So what are these philosophical pillars that form the grounding of our understanding of science in general, and psychological science in particular? Looking back at the ancient world and prehistory, natural philosophers used logic and reason to try to understand all aspects of the world. They were early rationalists. Think of folks like Thales and Anaximander, trying to use logic and reason to identify the physis, the physical basis for all other things, whose name would give rise to the field of physics, and whose pursuits are still alive in today's physical chemistry. And they weren't entirely off base, with Thales, for example, suggesting that water was the essential basis of all other substances, and thus life. Isn't it interesting that physicists today are still using good old H2O as an indicator of the potential for life on other planets? And Anaximander, who came after him, suggested we needed to look much smaller. Little did he know, still today we'd be looking for that smallest particle. Many rationalists went so far as to say not only could you use the mind to understand reality, but the mind is the only thing you should trust to understand reality. This is exemplified in Zeno's paradox. Imagine an arrow in flight, leading from a bow to an apple on someone's head. To get to the apple, it must first go half the distance, and then, of course, go half of the remaining distance, and so on. The trouble is, because distance is continuous and can always be divided in half again, the arrow cannot ever, logically, mathematically, truly arrive. But, you say, I saw it hit the apple. Your mistake, says Zeno, is trusting your senses. Your senses say it arrived, but it couldn't have. Your senses lie. Trust only the mind. This, of course, led folks like Socrates and Plato to use the mind to try to fully understand the true world beyond the senses, to get to the core essence of all things, or what Plato referred to as the forms. But what about our senses, you might ask? Well, Plato had an answer for that too, in the analogy of the divided line. Rationalists can be said to be most interested in knowledge on the higher portion of the divided line, approaching the good or divinity, depending on your translation and interpretation. Being more philosopher than mathematician, Plato clearly placed mathematical reasoning as further from the good than purely rational understanding of the world, these forms, the core essence. We think in math, but we truly understand in forms. But the unenlightened or uneducated, that is, non-philosophers, live not in the world of knowledge, but that of opinion, observing only physical objects, which are merely representations to our senses of those forms, or even more distant from the good, mere images of those objects, reflections, paintings, sculptures, words. It all sounds so reasonable, so, well, rational. And then along came Aristotle, a student of Plato's, with an important question. How do we get to know anything at all about those forms? How does that knowledge occur? Plato was a nativist who claimed that all knowledge must be innate. Aristotle proposed a different path. Perhaps we can observe the physical world, both images, but more importantly, actual physical things, the world of objects, and use our observations to draw conclusions about the forms, using the mind to understand the ideal form by looking at the patterns among those things that approximate the form. And thus we have empiricism, deriving knowledge from experience. But Aristotle didn't just stumble on empiricism. He was influenced by early medical practitioners who were less interested in truth and more interested in practical applications of knowledge to better human existence. They would, therefore, look to what works and especially focus on humans as primary subjects of interest. Jump back to around the time of Zeno, and you have Alcmaeon, less interested in physis and more interested in health and well-being, who did some of the earliest noted human dissections and placed the mind in the brain through his empirical observations. And of course, we have Hippocrates, who above all else wanted to test every theory in the real and practical world. He wanted to experience it himself to understand its basis in reality. Aristotle would have been approximately 14 when Hippocrates died, and it is feasible that he studied with him or studied his work, as Hippocrates traveled much of Greece teaching and practicing medicine, and Aristotle was in northern Greece. So, we have rationalists relying on the mind and empiricists relying on observation. So who are these romantics? Well, they came along much later and found themselves looking back over histories of philosophies that sound great and all, but contradict each other, and reality on one hand, and a medical field, among other sciences, littered with discarded hypothesis after discarded hypothesis, most especially when they try to figure out human beings. Basically, humans are irrational and unpredictable, and therefore cannot be understood by reason or observation alone, or at least so say the Romantics. Rationalists and empiricists both, according to the Romantic, failed to account for the unique and often innate inner nature of each individual that defies both rationality and probability. Science simply cannot understand humans because of this. Each individual, to a romantic, would have his or her own truth, and would thus follow their emotions or intuition to gain a deeper knowledge of the self. Feelings, therefore, not reason or observation, would and should guide human behavior, which has led to an increased interest in children and nature for nature's sake. Plato would call it a move away from the good, an embracing of opinion over knowledge. But romantics would say that humans are not robots. Well, if they knew what robots were. And that they cannot, therefore, be understood in the same way that we would understand robots. I hope this helps to clear up the difference and the relationship between rationalism, empiricism, and romanticism. As always, if you have more questions, you can reach out to me, and I'd be happy to assist you.